Welcome to Charles Dickens, A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hello everyone, today's guest is a hugely celebrated actor, writer, comedian, director, and broadcaster. But I can already see him tearing up those labels and starting again. Always wary of being imprisoned by nouns, our guest prefers to live his life as a verb. He is a person who does things, and he never knows what he's going to do next. One moment he might be adapting the Greek myths in his trilogy of Mythos, Heroes, and Troy, which opens an entire cosmos to readers who never would have thought that these stories were for them. Or he might be playing the lead role in a biopic of his hero Oscar Wilde, or writing the book for a West End and Broadway hit, directing an Evelyn Waugh adaptation, playing Malvolio at Shakespeare's Globe, directed by our mutual friend Tim Carroll from episode 2 of this series. But, of course, there's an entire generation who grew up with his unforgettable and very Dickensian characterization of General Sir Anthony Cecil Hogmanay Melchett in the comedy series Blackadder, a programme I would watch avidly whilst pretending to revise for my history GCSE. I am, of course, speaking of the inimitable Stephen Fry. And today, he is going to help us steer a path through what many consider to be Dickens's masterpiece, the mysterious and thrilling Bleak House. Joining us also to read extracts from the novel is the wonderful actress Sally Scott. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm honoured to be one of your Dickensian investigators.
Oh gosh, me too. I'm so thrilled to have you here. And I suppose my first question for you is really, do you remember where you were when you first picked up this enormous book?
I do, because I have to confess I hadn't read it till I got to university. It wasn't, as it were, a set text, but I spent the holidays, or vacs as they were known, not short for vaccinations, but vacations, an Americanism that is for some reason used at university. So I spent my vacs catching up on novelists I hadn't completely finished with, as it were. So I read 2 E.M. Forsters I hadn't read, and then I read about 7 Dickenses that I hadn't read, one of which was Bleak House, which struck me with a broadside. I almost feel it changed me. It was such an extraordinary experience compared to the other books, which I completely loved and still love. But there's something about Bleak House that just gave me a sort of a clue in the Ariadne sense of a sort of string leading out of a labyrinth, but in this sense leading into a labyrinth of a different way of reading, because it's a book about reading in some ways, isn't it?
Yes. And when you describe a labyrinth, the labyrinth is made of fog, perhaps, in this one, isn't it?
Yes, fog begins the story in the most memorable fashion in this sort of extra character that is part of the book, which is the voice of the storyteller. Well, there are 2 voices, of course, which is very rare in Dickens. One is this very almost bombastic rhetorical figure who occasionally addresses us directly when he sees an injustice or some horror, when he peeps into the houses of London and blows away the fog and lets us see. He will call us my lords, ladies and gentlemen, and accuse us of standing by or sitting nonchalantly apart from the horror and distress that he sees in the city and in human life. And so we're involved ourselves. And then the other narrator is Esther Summerson, the heroine, I suppose you'd call her. In some ways, her mother is the heroine of the story, or spoiler alert, the woman who turns out to be her mother, I should say.
Yes, so Lady Dedlock is the sort of tragic heroine, perhaps.
She is.
Yeah. I've got a lot of time for Esther, because I know Esther comes under a little bit of criticism for being wet or speaking twaddle, and you think, well, if you really walk in her shoes and think about the childhood she had, I think she's wonderful. I really cherish her for the simple fact that she doubts herself. And I know you mustn't doubt yourself too much, but I think too many people in the book are absolutely certain of their own positions.
I think you're completely right. We discover quite early on that she was brought up by a rather brutal woman called Miss Barbary, who constantly reminded her that she was a disgrace, which we know means she was born out of wedlock, which is a kind of pun, because it turns out that her mother is actually named Deadlock, which has the natural meaning of deadlock, stuck in this aristocratic world as her mother is, but also it reminds us of her being born out of wedlock, which was the great disgrace for anyone. And it's the child that gets the blame. And after that, it's the woman that gets the blame. The man never does.
Dinner was over, and my godmother and I were sitting at the table before the fire. Her darkened face had such power over me. She said slowly in a cold, low voice, I see her knitted brow and pointed finger, "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better, and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can."
She reminds me, Esther, and I agree with you, I have a great deal of time for her. She reminds me very much of Jane Austen's most insipid, some people would say, heroine Fanny in Mansfield Park, also regarded as a bit of a drip and a bit sort of goody two-shoes compared to the bubbly Eliza Bennet and Anne Elliot and others who, you know, the sisters in Sense and Sensibility all seem to have more life. But I think the point is, with characters like that you understand that some people aren't extrovert and full of charm that win over the reader with their vivacity. Some of them are quiet and staid, but have a deep quality of honour and a placid nature, which is a very common human nature. In fact, most of us know people who always apologise because they aren't the life and soul of the party, and I'm a bit shy and I don't like going out. But there are very often people we value enormously. And I think we should in literature too. We should take a note of Esther and realise that she, as we would say now, negotiates her lived experience with splendid honour.
Absolutely. And of course, there are extroverts in life that are not always the life and soul of the party. You've described, I'm sure I've read this sentence from you somewhere, where you described the yawning chasm between public and private.
Yeah, absolutely. And novels, as Dickens was experimenting with, I mean, it was still a relatively young form. I mean, he's only 50 years after Jane Austen was at her peak, for example. And he's discovering that novels can move in and out of the public and private characters that, or natures of those characters that he is portraying, and that is part of what a novel uniquely can do, that it can bring you inside a character's mind and then it can lift you above like a drone shot looking down, or like a marionetteer or something.
Yes, and there's that fantastic description in the opening chapter of imagining people being up in a balloon.
Yes.
A sort of an illusion of the city being in the clouds because of the fog. So yes, he straight away has that aerial view you just mentioned between the two narratives. There's the third person narrative, which is more Dickens, isn't it? And Esther's first person. And then there's the different uses of tense that Dickens uses as well. But you do read it, I think, and you're so absorbed in it that all of that passes you by without you noticing sometimes, I think.
That's right. The third person narrator does use the historic present tense, whereas Esther is always writing from the past. And without us necessarily knowing it, that immediately tells us that Esther will get through this because she's not writing it from the grave, we assume.
Yes.
It's not papers discovered post-mortem. And so even when it gets to a part of the story where she becomes dangerously ill, we sort of know she must pull through. But we don't know that about any of the other characters, and she doesn't know it about any of the other characters. So our knowledge is compromised and played with wonderfully. And I think the whole thrill of the book is that, I mean, I can remember this first reading, which I can't of a lot of books. I mean, I sort of dimly recall when I first read this book or that book. But with Bleak House, I can remember even that first chapter thinking, this is all going to connect up. as we start to meet different characters, I think, how are all these people? I know they must be connected. And you sort of know that it's a book. I use the word clues, meaning like Ariadne, a string that she gave, a thread that she gave to Theseus to play out through the maze, through the labyrinth on his way to the Minotaur so that he could follow his way back out. Those were called clues. And we've used the word since in crossword puzzles, and most notably, especially with reference to this book, in detective stories, which this famously is. Some people would call it one of the very first detective stories. It's up there with Dickens's friend Wilkie Collins' Moonstone, for example, or the Edgar Allan Poe stories. And it's certainly Inspector Bucket is a memorable figure from Scotland Yard, whom one could regard as a true fictional detective. So there are clues, and very quickly you know there are clues, and you know they're all over the place, that they're in a lawsuit, they're in papers held by some weird figure, crook, and you know that there's a mystery. There's even a character called Nemo. I mean, it's so in your face, kind of symbolic, and yet it's also deeply detailed, and a whole picture is brought to life of this world, mostly London, the legal area of London, and the little courts and strange places where people who are satellites of the legal industry, either by being law copiers or something similar, selling legal ink. And it's a profession that has its own sub-professions and trades. And we meet lots of lawyers. We meet the most famous one, Mr. Tulkinghorn, who's a malevolent figure in the background, pulling strings, a sort of spider, monitoring the twitches on the web, and a rather fruity, orotund figure called Kenge. Conversation Kenge is his nickname because he speaks so absurdly. And there's a charming sort of legal clerk called Mr. Guppy, who's a divine figure.
It was at the theatre that I began to be made uncomfortable again by Mr. Guppy. I was sitting in front of the box one night with Ada and Richard, when, happening to look down into the pit, I saw Mr. Guppy, with his hair flattened down upon his head and woe depicted in his face, looking up at me. I felt all through the performance that he never looked at the actors, but constantly looked at me, and always with a carefully prepared expression of the deepest misery and the profoundest dejection. It was so very embarrassing, and so very ridiculous.
So there are all these characters circling around law, and then in the middle of this maelstrom, there is the famous legal case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, which has a huge sort of symbolic, fantastic quality to it, as so much in the story does. It's not just Jarndyce and Jarndyce that everybody thinks, well, it's ridiculous. He's doing a verbal cartoon of a legal case that is so mired in complexity and has so many different people expecting money from it. It's a will or a series of wills. It's a fortune that only the Chancery Court can sort out, apparently. And it's been going on for decades and sucking the life out of all the suitors to the case. And you think, well, that's a kind of cartoon, just as then Mr. Crook dies by exploding, spontaneous combustion.
Yes.
Kind of leaving just a sort of layer of fat all around the room.
Horrific, the description in that entire sequence, isn't it?
Yes, it really is amazing.
And if you read it with hindsight, it's even worse because, the signs of the soot falling in the room below and this goo.
Yeah, this sort of lard-like tallow. Yes, it's quite disgraceful. Because he's become literally a human candle and his fat has burned down. And that's supposedly the explanation. I remember writing essays and things on Bleak House at university. I did a dissertation on it, and I remember researching or trying to research all the cases of spontaneous combustion that may or may not have occurred. And I know Dickens was actually quite cross that people thought he was making it up or exaggerating or kind of falling for an urban myth. And in the introduction to the first edition of the book, when it was produced as a book rather than in its 20 serial parts, which is how it first appeared in the early 1850s, I think it was, he quite roundly accused his detractors of not understanding the truth of the spontaneous combustion. And people thought the same of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. So there is this feeling in the book that he's moving into an almost modernist symbolic kind of literature where he's, which is a fantastic and brilliant caricaturing of the world. But at the same time, there is this fantastic detail, this extraordinary ability to make it all real, and you can smell it and touch it and taste it and all the things that good writing is supposed to do for your senses.
London. Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke luring down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes, gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun.
That's the great fun of Dickens, I think. As you were saying, his use of caricature and symbolism. There's actually a phrase I picked up from the book, reading it again in preparation for our chat, which is augmentation of reality.
Brilliant.
Which is essentially augmented reality, as we'd call it today.
They are. Here we are. Yes.
Exactly.
And as you know, and as many tuning in will know, Dickens was a prodigious walker. One of the most extraordinary things about Dickens, and it's true of many people from the Victorian era, is just the energy they had. It is almost unbelievable. And that's true of, Ruskin and Carlyle and Darwin and Tennyson, the amount of letters they wrote, the sheer volume of correspondence they kept up on top of the actual writing they were doing. And in Dickens's case, it's not just those enormous novels, and Bleak House is one of his longest, if not his longest. I think Our Mutual Friend is also very long, I think, from roughly the same period of his writing. But anyway, it's a very big book, certainly by modern standards. On top of that, he was writing whole editions of his magazines that he ran and keeping up a furious correspondence and walking 20, 30, 40 miles a day around London, absorbing it. A later character that we think of as sort of an epitome of Victorian London is Sherlock Holmes. And there's a great deal that you can think of as part of the Victorian experience, is that they were aware of this enormous organic entity that had been built up in their own lifetimes, the city, that had become something quite different from what was a town that then became a larger town. London became something else. It became a living organism, and the people within it, the bacteria, you and me and everyone, are connected in an organic, holistic way, that it's, without being too kind of pretentious and sophomoric, as they say in America, Dickens, we know, hated utilitarianism. He wrote against it most fiercely in Hard Times. This idea that people are units and that their satisfaction can be quantified by what the original utilitarians called a calculus of felicity, literally a mathematics that could say the greatest good for the greatest number is the way it's usually shortened. And the industrial North that is the subject of the Hard Times, and the ironmaster Gradgrind and his insistence on facts, that facts were collectible. And there's a famous scene where Jessie, I think she's called, the girl who's grown up in the sort of circus and amongst horses, and she's a free and wonderful spirit, and she's pushed into this classroom where Gradgrind is showing off the teaching, and the teacher says, pupil number 5 or whatever, define a horse. And Jessie just kind of freezes. How do you define a living creature? She doesn't think that. We think that for her. And then, what's he called? He's got a wonderful name. Bitzer, this annoying boy, says, graminivorous quadruped. Graminivorous meaning, eats grain and grasses, and quadruped four-legged. And says, good boy, you know what a horse is. And that is the perfect moment in which Dickens encapsulates this. And also you see Gradgrind's cabinet of, like all Victorians, he's a taxonomist. He collects labels, orders, categorizes. Everything has its place and can be numbered. And that is part of what the Victorian scientific movement and the Industrial Revolution and the economics and the political science of the time were all about. But Dickens, I think, understood the opposite point of view, that rather than atomistic, in which we're all individuals bouncing off each other in a kind of swirl of Brownian motion in the fog and smoke of reality, we're all bouncing off each other as individuals. Yes, that's one way of looking at it, but the other way is to understand that we're actually all connected. We're not separate particles. And the two things in a city, in his day, he didn't have electricity and the telecommunications we have now, but the two things that unite people, or at least that can connect people, are money and disease.
Yes.
And Dickens almost treats them as the same. You know, Joe gets given money from Nemo, Joe the crossing sweeper, who literally sweeps the crossing, the way people connect. He sweeps it away. It's a wonderful image. And he's one of the most memorable and beautiful characters Dickens ever created. And his death and his complaints, which are utterly, really without self-pity, they're just a kind of realistic recognition of the deep tragedy of his existence, of being moved along all the time, being moved along, not having a place. But he connects. He gives the disease to Esther that nearly kills her. He is given money that gives Tulkinghorn the knowledge that he knows something about Nemo that may threaten the deadlocks, and so he has Bucket move Joe along. That Joe is the unwitting receipt of things that connect him to people he doesn't really feel connected to, but Dickens shows he is, and that money and disease are vectors of communication that are sort of the same. They despoil and they ruin. One, of course, we run away from, and the other we run towards. But it's really interesting, I think, when you look at it in that way.
Absolutely.
I think Bernard Shaw said that at one point there are thousands rotting their lives away in the jails of Europe for writing pamphlets a tenth as seditious as Bleak House. Something like that. That's the thought he expressed. He recognized, as I think anyone does when you read it, that it is an absolute critique of hierarchy. If you like, this is a bit Niall Ferguson, but the world of Lester Dedlock is a world of hierarchy. Everyone has their place in strata, and he's at the top. And he's constantly going, Sir Lester. He's always going on about how things threaten that order, and his thing is the floodgates. The floodgates will open, and when that happens, he and his type, the aristocrats, will be over, and he has to stand up for that in a ramrod, deadlocked fashion, because hierarchy is deadlocked. It's like a Neapolitan ice cream, frozen layers and levels. But Dickens is arguing that it's a network of nodes of connection, which is not a hierarchy. It's far more like what we understand society to be, a network. And we actually have it now. When we say network, we think of it as a technological thing. And in a way it was in Dickens's time, and it was messengers and runners and policemen and maids and people who connected, people who in Victorian terms shouldn't be connected. And Dickens is showing the disease of Victorian England is that everybody thinks there's a place for everything, a number for everything, and the world will work if people stick to their place, and they can be well treated in their place, and they can be charmed, you know, as famously Scrooge says, are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? They have places to go. But what mustn't happen is they mustn't fuse together, or the floodgates will open and the whole cake, or the whole Neapolitan will melt. And he's saying, but you don't understand. Human beings aren't really like that. There's a network. There's a connection between the old soldier who runs a shooting gallery. There's a connection between him and the neighbour of John Jarndyce, who has a law case going on with the deadlocks. They're all connected. And, you know, we know this phrase, only connect. It's a famous Forstierian motto of Howard's End. And we know through comic novels like Dirk Gently and so on, that you can use this fact, the fact in physics that everything is connected, to paint visions of how humanity is. But I don't think anybody did it in quite the way that Dickens did. And he had to help him that he was at a time where suddenly in the city, although there were areas where Joe was, you know, the Tom All Alone's, his rookery in St. Giles's, and all these places, he shows that they're all actually one, and that mankind is one. And in that case, it's a fantastic novel of brotherhood, of connection, a tragic one.
Yes.
Sorry, I've talked far so much. I've given my thesis.
No, this is wonderful.
What connection can there be between the place in Lincolnshire, the house in town, and the whereabout of Joe the outlaw with the broom, who had that distant ray of light upon him when he swept the churchyard step? What connection can there have been between many people in the innumerable histories of this world, who from opposite sides of great gulfs have nevertheless been very curiously brought together? Joe sweeps his crossing all day long, unconscious of the link, if any link there be.
I really wanted to pick up on what you were saying about connections, because, as you said, when you picked up the book initially, you knew that there were connections there.
Yes.
But you do wonder, because it's such an enormous novel, and if Dickens is writing it in serial form, how on earth did he maintain the connections in his own mind to be able to hold it all together?
And don't you think, as you read it, you're almost hearing the scratch of his nib on the page. You almost feel that you know he's just come up with this solution to that problem, and he's introduced a series of characters and ideas that will shed light on this corner. So quite late on you meet some characters who are going to be very important. The fellow who turns out to be the son of the Dedlock's housekeeper, Ranswell, I think her name is, and one of his most malevolent characters, Grandfather Smallweed, who really is as repulsive a figure as anyone.
Yes, Smallweed, he reminds me of Francis Bacon, the screaming popes.
Yes, absolutely. He's got a smeared quality to him.
Yes, he's horrifying, isn't he? But what's so brilliant, because it's Dickens, there's something hilarious about it as well.
Absolutely.
He wins himself trying to throw cushions at his wife.
Yes, that's right.
And he keeps his feet in the drawer of his chair like a paper foot bath, I think is the phrase.
It is phenomenal. And we're laughing here, and it's worth it if people are listening and thinking, oh, I'm going to read Bleak House. It sounds amazing. And it is amazing, and I think you'll be astonished. It doesn't have the Pickwickian joviality in many places that you associate with some of Dickens, that you get with Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, for example. It's darker. It's a more adult novel in a strange sort of way. And that's a thrilling thing, because you realise that Dickens was almost throwing away the thing that made him most popular, and that is the creation of adorable characters that you're all going to imitate, like Mrs. Gamp, that you can all do an imitation of virtually, like Uriah Heep, even he makes them darker, more tragic, or more malevolent. I mean, Mr. Jarndyce is perhaps a more serious, although he is totally adorable, version of Mr. Pickwick, and he is benign and he's friendly. But somehow Mr. Pickwick is a bit of an ass, and we love him for it. He's just a little too innocent. And that's what made him so popular in the early days of Dickens' writing, of course, is that he was a twinkly little set of eyes through which to see England as they travelled around. But in the case of Jarndyce, he has been soured and embittered by the horror of watching people fall for the Jarndyce case, but he hasn't turned himself into a sour and embittered man. But very notably, for someone as benevolent as he is, and he is genuinely one of the kindest men you'd ever meet in fiction, he has his moods. He is I won't say he's bipolar exactly, but he warns people to whom he's close that just occasionally he has to go and sit alone and not be disturbed in what is nicknamed the growlery, where he has to growl. It's a bit like Churchill and his black dog, and I have it, and many people tuning in will know exactly what that's about. You need a growlery. You need to sit somewhere. Doesn't matter how charming you are. It's not a gift that can keep on giving. Sometimes life takes things out of you. So even the jolly, totally good characters have, I won't say a dark side exactly, but they're fully featured with the human instincts, including the sadder ones.
Yes, and I think Dickens plays a bit with the reader on that. Certainly if you're aware of Pickwick, a character like Harold Skimpole, for example, yes, who charms everyone at the beginning. And it makes me think, I'm sure I heard you say once in an interview, Stephen, and it really struck me, and it wasn't pursued, the comment that you made. But you were saying about how there are no grown-ups anymore.
Yes, it is a thing I often talk about in the world. And, this is not an attack on any particular piece of modern culture, but the fact is that the most money is made in the world for adults as well as for young adults and youth and children from movies about people with superpowers who have, fly around with sparks flying from their arse and turning invisible and so on. And a sort of pseudo-exegesis has built up around it where they can be talked about as if they're Shakespeare and have the depth of... And, and I sound as if I'm mocking, and I'm not. I can sit down and watch Avengers Assemble. And I think, yeah, what's this? I like Robert Downey Jr. and, there's some nice people in it and they're quite fun. But it is for children. These are children's entertainments.
Yes.
30 years ago, that's what they would be. And the world has changed. And people go around wearing sports clothes as adults. That is, I mean, I'm guilty myself. This is known as a polo shirt and baseball hats and everything is... you go in meetings. There used to be a time, and I'm not supporting these institutions. They're, of course, part of the elite that we all despise. But 5-star hotels, for example, used to make people wear suit and tie to go in them. They had to stop that because every Hollywood director and every kind of startup billionaire wore children's clothes. And then they would go to and sit there, and a waiter would come, and what can I get you, sir? And they'll say, I'll have a milkshake and a burger.
Which is very Trumpian, isn't it, actually?
It is. I mean, and this is children's food. I'm sorry, but it is. And it's children's food and children's entertainment and children's books, are kept over into adulthood. And Dickens seemed to have a similar view about adults who stay childish. And there's more than one example, in a way, in Bleak House. There's a sort of infantilism about quite a few characters, the turvy drops, I love that. And it's almost as if Dickens is mocking himself because I think people, he's called the great Victorian writer, and of course he is, primus inter pares, or no, primus inter non pares, he first among non-equals. But almost all his books are set in the past. They're usually set in a Hanoverian reign, not the Victorian, not the Saxe-Coburg, if you like. And that's true of Bleak House as well. I think it's considered to be set in the reign of George IV in the 1820s, maybe a tiny bit early, just before Victoria gets onto the throne. And of course, his most popular novel, one of the most popular novels ever written, Tale of Two Cities, is obviously set at the time of the French Revolution. And almost all his books actually are set in the past. David Copperfield, all the others. If you think of a typical Dickensian costume, it's actually late Georgian. It's not Victorian that you see the men in. And so in the case of Turvey Drop, who's a dancing teacher, or he lets his son do all the work, he lives in the period of the Regency and dimly claims acquaintance with Prinny, the Prince Regent, and wears the clothes and the corsets and the slightly exaggerated, fobs and quizzing glasses.
Just then there appeared from a side door old Mr. Turveydrop. He was a fat old gentleman with a false complexion, false teeth, false whiskers, and a wig. He was pinched in and swelled out, and strapped down as much as he could possibly bear. He stood poised on one leg, in a high-shouldered state of elegance not to be surpassed. He had a cane, he had an eyeglass, he had a snuff-box, he had rings, he had wristbands, he had everything but any touch of nature. He was not like youth, he was not like age. He was not like anything in the world but a model of deportment. As he bowed to me in that tight state, I almost believe I saw creases come into the whites of his eyes.
And it's as if Dickens is sort of making fun of himself for being stuck in that same period, because one of the things critics now and then in his lifetime noticed was that a lot of his heroines were childlike. Little Nell and all those sort of, and Little Dorrit. Even the word little on is a sort of, and children were his heroes after Pickwick Papers, at least. Oliver Twist, obviously, and David Copperfield and Great Expectations narrated about childhood, going back to childhood, trying to sort out problems that childhood had caused, which we all know Dickens was naturally disposed to do with the awful childhood he had, and the scapegrace father that he reproduced in so many different stories. And so Dickens is stuck in his childhood, like a lot of people who've had an abusive or an unpleasant childhood. He's got issues to work out, as we'd now say, and he knows it, and his critics knew it, and, So I think in Bleak House, he kind of confronts it in a way. He gives us a character like Turveydrop, who is a sort of very extreme version of Dickens, stuck in the Regency period. And he gives us the wonderful Harold Skimpole, whom you mentioned, who the world agree is based on Leigh Hunt, who was a great literary critic and a poet and a friend of Keats and a remarkable man, but who affected childishness himself. Oh, I understand nothing. I don't understand anything. I don't know the way the world works. What is this? A guinea? What can a guinea be? A pound and a shilling? They're different. How can they? Oh, no, I'm too stupid to understand. Could you sort it out for me? And maybe you give me some of your money here and I'll spend it for you. And so he has a life of complete luxury, spoiled by everybody around him, simply by pretending to be innocent. And it's an important sort of facet in this world of which is about guilt and innocence, and actually becomes a detective story, as I say. And so this person who pretends to be innocent, and we see straight away as a manipulative swine.
Absolutely. That thing you were saying about utilitarianism earlier, that sort of fight between that and romanticism.
Yes.
You also mentioned William Guppy, and I think he's an interesting character in that he seems to fall between those two positions.
Yes.
Because there's a moment where Dickens mentions him as being both romantic and forensic at the same time.
Absolutely. And, of course, he falls in love with Esther and proposes to her, and she sees him again after she's had her illness, her fever, which we assume is smallpox because it leaves her disfigured. And he, of course, no longer wants to marry her. So he's not only, he doesn't have the romantic sensibility of one who will sacrifice his possible happiness on the altar of his fervent love, but he thinks, no, I don't want a wife who looks like that. Thank you very much.
It sort of gets worse, doesn't it? Because Guppy makes the proposal and he is rejected. Then Esther suffers her illness. Her face is disfigured. So he retracts the proposal. Yes. And then makes it again.
It is brilliant. And your point, of course, romanticism is exactly the word I should have brought up when talking about that, the symbolic side of him. A lot of it is part of what used to be called the pathetic fallacy, which is to say that in romantic writing, poetry and fiction, the landscape and the weather take on the emotional experiences that are being undergone by the heroes of the book. So for the hero's stormy, the world is stormy. The things around him are transformed by him, and he usually is a him as a romantic hero, and by his sensibilities. And that's called the pathetic fallacy, pathetic in the sense of feeling. And so you can look on the book as having a lot of that the explosion of Mr. Crook and the some of the more extreme descriptions of the world you can regard as symbolic and also as reflective of the nature of the characters and what they're undergoing and of the mystery and the sort of cancer at the heart of the flesh of the book. But what's so clever and great about Dickens is that his romantic pathetic fallacy is actually almost on a Zola-esque element of reality. It's a realistic portrait. And I know, again, this is just sort of dimly recalling my research getting on for 50 years ago. But I, and it was before there was an internet, so it actually meant I physically had to go into libraries and do things with index cards. But I know a lot of legal historians say that this book is extremely useful in terms of bringing to life the truth of the Chancery Court and this ecosystem of lawyers and paralegals and legal stationers and so on. And of course, Dickens, as we know, was a journalist who covered the law courts as well as Parliament. He covered the law, and so he did have a really deep understanding of how this incredibly complex and incomprehensible and impenetrable world was run. And therefore he could call out its corruption, and he could call out the danger it was to sanity and to insanity in both its original sense of health. It is like a public health problem, the law, as he saw it. A public mental health problem, as we'd now say. It drove people mad. And we see, from the beginning, we see that process. We're told it when we first meet John Dyson Jarndyce, and we meet some of these characters Who's the man from Shropshire? There's the man, Mr.
Gridley.
Mr. Gridley, poor Mr. Gridley. And of course, we meet Miss Flight, and who's... because the names are also part of that symbolic romantic thing that Miss Flight keeps birds, and the birds are in the cage, and she'll let them out when the case is, over. They've all got symbolic names, truth, honesty, prudence, and all that sort of thing, and they're all trapped. It's an image of the court case itself.
Hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon and spinach.
And we meet Jarndyce when he is appointed ward of these two wards in Chancery, who are children who are orphaned, and they're not related enough to stop them falling in love and marry. But they're both potential beneficiaries of the money from the will if the case ever gets solved. And Jarndyce tells them with absolute clarity and certainty that they must never involve themselves in the case. Look at these people around us. Their lives are ruined. Their minds have gone. That Jarndyce has destroyed them. And they nod, these young, healthy, new generation people. And we watch in horror. And it's one of the great stories of the book. It's so recognizable. A young man with ideals, but also ambition and hope, is slowly sucked into something he doesn't quite understand. It's the equivalent of him, I don't know, starting off day trading or online, and suddenly owing hundreds of thousands and then millions, and then not being able to get out of it. All undertaken with the best motives. And when the family members, especially the women, say, "Are you sure this is wise?" "Oh, you don't understand. I understand this. It's fine. Don't worry. I know what I'm doing." How many times have men said that to women and been wrong and self-deluding in the most appalling way? And we watch Richard's journey in horror as that happens. And it is a total tragedy. He ends up dead, of course.
It had given me a pang to hear Richard sob and see the tears start out between his fingers. But that was infinitely less affecting to me than the hopeful animation with which he said these words. "I have looked well into the papers, Esther. I have been deep in them for months," he continued, recovering his cheerfulness in a moment. "And you may rely upon it that we shall come out triumphant. It will be all right at last, and then you shall see."
And it's very tragic, obviously, that Miss Flight outlives Richard.
Yes.
Old Miss Flight is alive at the end, and he isn't. Yes, it's very sad. And there's something else, is that these characters fall into the trap of Jarndyce, but they seem to know that it's going to fail. But it's like an addiction where one part of their mind can see it for what it is, but at the same time they can't let it go.
And that's true of all addictions, I can tell you. That's true of alcohol, it's true of, drugs, it's true of betting. The terror and pity of that addiction is the part of the brain that knows that this is destroying the addict. They know that. But nonetheless, they just have to. That next fix, that next day in court, that next line of coke, that next drink, whatever it is, that next bet on that horse, and then I'll be clear. I just need that, and then the next, and so on. And people watch by just in a state of sorrow and horror, unable to intervene, as the modern phrase is. And they try interventions with Richard. They all do. But of course, he also has his drug friend. He has. Who's the lawyer who, is it
Voles.
Oh, the Voles, Mr. Voles, who's a dead, horrifying figure. Kind of he's like a tomb, isn't he? And he sucks all the money, and occasionally when he deigns to speak as a proper person, we're getting there, Don't worry. Just a little more money and we'll be there.
Yes, and he also makes the distinction between something that's immoral and unlawful. In Voles' mind, something unlawful is to be avoided, but there's not really any such thing as immoral.
No, absolutely right. That's beautifully put. And I mean, the more you talk about it, I think it is one of those books that if you've read it once richly and enjoyed it, and maybe then come back to it a few years later, when you then have a conversation with someone about it who knows it as well as you do, you realize there are corners of it that you haven't even ever shared with anyone or even really thought consciously about, that have a depth and a magnificence and an interest and a sort of, they help illuminate the whole thing, and you'd never even considered them. It is full of these riches. It's very hard to describe exactly why it's such a satisfying and intriguing, beguiling read. I want to read it again, and I read it last about 2 years ago, I think. And actually, no, it was 2 years ago. I didn't read it. I had the enormous pleasure of being read it by Miriam Margolyes,
Yes.
who is the greatest reader of Dickens, I think. Well, Martin Jarvis is brilliant too, but she does Bleak House unabridged, and it's available for anyone who has one of those accounts with a talking book company, an audiobook company. And her characterizations are sublime. Her pacing and, the drama she gives it without overreading is phenomenal. So maybe for some people, that's the best way for them to approach the book. And it's a great opportunity. You can go for walks, and for 3 months at least, perhaps, depending on how long your walks are, you will have this phenomenal, complex and thrilling novel read to you, which is probably how Dickens would have liked it.
Yes, I second that. Miriam Margolyes' reading of Bleak House is fantastic, isn't it? All 40 hours or so of it.
Yes, is that how long it is? 40 hours, my God.
I'm sure it's at least 40 hours, yeah. And I think, our discussion points to the very seriousness of the book, but it is, as you say, a very thrilling and entertaining read, isn't it? It really carries you along.
Yes, I may have talked like a pretentious arsehole, and I'm sure I have, but none of that should let the story get in the way of you. That's not how you experience reading it, but it may make you think in all kinds of different directions. And it has a lot of it, qualities of Victorian melodrama, the dying woman hugging her dead lover's tomb in the churchyard, and that's a very Victorian image. You can just see a sort of Doré or Daumier engraving of it, can't you? And the wistful death of young Joe, and moving along for the last time to a better place, and so on. You can see that there is some of the old Dickensian sentiment, but it's much less saccharine, much less, the famous Oscar Wilde comment of you have to have a heart of stone to read The Death of Little Nell without laughing. And it's nothing like as sickly as that, although I have a fondness for the old Curiosity Shop and Little Nell.
I know, I love Nell. I don't find it funny at all.
No.
I wonder how serious Oscar Wilde was being.
I think it's because in Oscar's time it was considered the acme of tragic literature. And I think he knew that while it was charming, and he'd read and admired Dickens, that if Victorians thought tragedy stopped with Little Nell, they really ought to think harder and deeper, I think. And also, it's just a great gag. Oscar was never one to pass up the opportunity for a laugh. Listen, I want to congratulate you, of course. You've worked with my very dear friend, the great director, Tim Carroll, on a production of A Christmas Carol, which I never got to see, but which I've seen bits of because it's been, bits were videoed. And I have to say, it looks absolutely stunning.
Gosh, thank you.
Are you going to be performing it elsewhere?
Yes, absolutely. The details are still being finalised, but yeah, and gosh, you'd be so welcome to come along and see it.
Well, let me know, won't you, when it's next to it, and let your audience know when it's next going. I'm sure you will.
I will.
But it's been great talking to you. And as I say, you've sent me on my way to reread Bleak House, I think. It's just so great.
Oh, well, I'm so thrilled. Thank you so much for your time, Stephen. And I'll let you know when this is up.
It's a deal.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. I want to keep adverts off this series, so if you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation, please follow the link in the description wherever you get this podcast, and you can make a small donation there. Thank you very much, and see you next time.